Hello, how are
How are you
you?
doing? Good morning.
Good morning. How you doing?
All right, yeah, very well. Thank you ever so much for your time because I know
Of
you're very
course.
busy in post production.
Yeah, we're finishing up a doc right now we've been working on for the last year and change. So that's getting there.
Fantastic. And of course, we're going to look forward to welcoming you to the UK. You're going to be on home soil in January because you're coming to the Prince Charles cinema for a series.
Finally, yeah, I've been clawing my way back to the UK since before COVID started. So I'm very happy that I can finally get back.
And connect with the fans, I was going to say. And of course, there's a series of films that you've made and have been involved with, starting obviously with Bill and Ted and a series of films there. And I mean, they're such adorable characters, aren't they? There's an idealism about them and a sincerity that's kind of been throughout the whole series. But watching you both with Keanu and yourself, because you've worked together for such a long time, there's got to be such a trust, which for you as actors has got to be such a joy because you're just unencumbered and you can just enjoy the characters and have fun and be liberated by that, really.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we weren't exactly sure how that was going to manifest itself on this third movie because we spend a lot of time together as friends, but we're obviously not the characters. So we did find ourselves in the first week pleasantly surprised by how easy it was. Not the performance. The performance wasn't easy, but just the experience of being kind of back in a playground together that part was easy.
Yeah, exactly. And Fever is another film that's going to be screening there. And I think what was interesting about watching this film is how clever it is to use comedy as a vehicle to raise awareness for important issues. And I wondered whether that's something that you can sort of cast your mind back to when you were making it in the first place. Because you said there's a line of dialogue about how man interferes with the natural working order, and I thought that was very clever.
Oh, Freaked. Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
Freaked. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we look. Our primary objective with that film was to make something very irreverent, right? Our influences were as much Warner Brothers cartoons and Mad Magazine and kind of the alternative comics and art scene of the 60s and 70s as it was anything else. But we also used it as an opportunity to kind of poke at certain power structures and the status quo and you know, it was an early 90s movie and we'd come out of the 80s, and the 80s were a very kind of a hyper corporatized period in art in the US and the UK and a lot of places. It was sort of the age of MTV. And so the film was a bit of a reaction to that too.
And you worked with the great Steve Johnson with the makeup effects there as well.
We worked with everybody. We worked with Steve, who's brilliant, and Tony Gardner and Bill Corso and Screaming Mad George. I mean, it was a massive, massive project in terms of physical effects. And we had three distinct, usually a movie has one, we had three distinct physical effects companies working at once on that. It looked like an army base camp. So we were very lucky, and we learned a lot because these guys were masters.
Yeah, they really, really are. We had the joy of meeting Steve. We did a documentary about Cleaning Up the Town, remembering Ghostbusters, the making of Ghostbusters, and Steve Johnson was one of the effects guys on that. So he's quite unique.
He is. He's a character and a half. Yeah.
He is, yeah. and Fever is another film that's going to be screening there, which you wrote and directed, and very much a thriller and a mystery. But I wondered whether there was a kind of a subtext really of an exploration into mental health. Was that something that...
Yeah, I mean, I think it was kind of, you know, it was a period of my 20s where a lot of people around me were having a really hard time. And I think it was just a kind of an exploration of committing to living a certain kind of life in in a hyper-capitalist society at that time, and the consequences of that on a lot of people. I think you could make, if you were in your 20s today, if I was in my 20s today, I could probably make a very similar film today, given what's going on in the world today and how difficult it is to sort of live a life of self-actualization in a culture that is so aggressively difficult. And this was sort of my look at that at that time. It sort of gives way to mental health issues, but it wasn't specifically about mental health issues as much as about those challenges. Funnily enough, I look at Zappa as a very similar movie about a very similar issue in a way, or a similar mindset. What interested me about Zappa was how committed he was to making art and living a certain type of life, albeit in a completely different generation, because he came up in the 60s and 70s. And just the incredible toll that took on him and the people around him personally, that was probably my primary motive for making that documentary.
Well, I was going to ask you obviously about Zappa, because that's also screening as well. And I believe it's on Blu-ray in the UK. It's been released.
Yes, as of yesterday. Yep.
Yeah. And what the thing with Zappa is it's such an intimate, documentary, respectful, and it's a tribute to him, really, isn't it? And I would have thought, again, when you make documentaries and you're sitting in front of people, you didn't sit in front of Zappa, but you have unfettered access to his archive. What a privileged position we're in, because we kind of become custodians of that story, and people are trusting us to be authentic. I imagine that was paramount to you, to be respectful to the Zappa family as well.
Yeah, I think it was, not to be disrespectful, it probably wasn't paramount, but it was in my, it was a priority. When I pitched the story to Gail, I actually said to her, with huge respect, because I had enormous respect for Gail Zappa. She was an incredible human being, who's no longer here. But I said to her that I needed to be kind of unshackled from them in a way, and allowed to just tell a story that was kind of honest and blunt, and wasn't a kind of family business dynasty narrative, right? And that without that freedom, it really wouldn't be worth doing, because it would end up kind of like a 2-hour commercial for the Zappa record business. And she was very cool about that. And so the editor, Mike Nichols, and I really just dug into telling the best story we could. But I wasn't cavalier about it. I definitely held them in mind, and also held Zappa in mind. I sort of felt his kind of spiritual presence, over my shoulder. And while we were saying some things about him that were critical, it wasn't, a whitewash. I didn't want to drag him through the mud, and I didn't want to drag the family through the mud.
And I think what's really sort of, you've had a luxury of doing, is being able to tell his story through his words, which makes it feel incredibly intimate. So I would imagine kind of, he was such a prolific archivist, wasn't he?
Yeah, and that was, there were many surprises making the movie. I'd say that one of the biggest pleasant surprises when we got into the archive was how much media there was of Zappa talking, either on camera or on audio, and that was unexpected. It had never, almost all the stuff we used had never been heard before. But to your point, it was very intimate. And why that was great for me was because the film I'd wanted to make was kind of a personal, intimate examination of this guy who to most people was so opaque, and wore a mask and was very much a showman who always had kind of a persona. And most of the documentaries that have been made about Zappa in the past, actually all of them really, I would say, never got behind the mask. It was always this very aloof persona, very entertaining, very articulate, but very aloof and distanced. And I really wanted to penetrate that and figure out who he actually was without the mask on, and all that media got us there.
Yeah, and I think as well that what we see is that, I find as artistic people, it's not always easy, and he he's kind of unapologetic about who he is, and you kind of have to accept him for who he is, or, you know, don't have him at all. And I rather found that very refreshing.
Me too. I mean, I think that's one of the things about Zappa that drew me to him as a person, regardless of his art, to be honest with you. But I also knew, being an artist myself and coming from a family of artists, I also knew, which is not, you know, revelatory, that that's a bit of a mask too, right? Like there's a self-protective mechanism. So for moving through the world as a creative person, where you're just kind of like, oh, I don't care, and, you know, whatever. You know, that thick exterior can often mask a very thin skin. Yeah. And I was interested in getting at that. I was interested in getting at his insecurities and his depression and some of the challenges that he was facing personally. And thankfully we were able to. Thankfully, you know, Zappa was an honest enough human being that there was media there that spoke to his insecurities.